Victor Nett pressed his boot into the back of the local shepherd's neck and spoke without looking down. "Tell me where the ghost shoots from, or I bury you next to the last man who didn't." The shepherd wept. He had no answer. No one did. 11 Navy SEALs were operating 3 kilometers east, and something had been keeping them alive for 9 days, something that left no footprint, no signature, no name. Victor had been hired to find it, to end it. He had no idea he was already being watched. If this kind of story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment. Tell us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The desert before sunrise has a particular kind of silence, not peaceful, not empty, but loaded the way a held breath is loaded. It is the silence of a place that has seen too many things die and has decided to keep every secret. Elena Castellano had been moving through that silence for 4 hours when she finally stopped. She did not sit. She did not crouch behind a rock or press herself against a ridgeline in any obvious way. She simply became still, and in becoming still, she became nothing. A shift in shadow, a fold in terrain, a trick of light on sand that the human eye slides past without registering, because the brain, even a trained brain, is always looking for shape and movement, and she had spent 6 years learning to offer neither. 400 meters to her northwest, a militia scout was eating a strip of dried meat and watching the pale line where the sky would eventually crack open into dawn. He had a rifle across his knees and a radio clipped to his vest, and he was looking in exactly the wrong direction for exactly the right reasons. Someone had placed him there to watch the northern approach, and the northern approach was where any reasonable person would come from. Elena had not come from the north. She had been watching him for 40 minutes. She knew the rhythm of his breathing by the rise and fall of his shoulders. She knew he was cold because he kept pulling his jacket tighter with his left hand while his right stayed close to the rifle. She knew he was bored and a little afraid because bored and afraid men make the same micro movements, a slight rock back and forth on the heels, a slow scan that never quite focuses, an attention that keeps drifting inward toward the warmth of somewhere else. She filed all of it away and kept watching. 3 kilometers east, 11 Navy SEALs were sleeping in rotation inside a hardened position they believed was concealed. It was not concealed, not from anyone who understood the desert the way Elena did. A thermal differential between the position and the surrounding ground was faintly visible to the right kind of eyes at the right kind of hour. The positioning of their sentries created a pattern visible from elevation. The water discipline was slightly off, not enough to compromise their immediate safety, but enough to tell someone paying attention that the platoon had been in country longer than their resupply schedule anticipated. Someone had to know these things. Someone had to track them. That was what Elena did. That was the only thing she did. She had no official designation in any military database that a standard security clearance could reach. She carried no identification. She wore no rank. Her name appeared in exactly one classified document set, and that document set was accessible to 4 people on the planet, 2 of whom would deny her existence under oath, and 1 of whom was dead. The 4th was a woman in a basement office in Arlington who had recruited Elena 6 years ago and who communicated with her through a dead drop system so archaic it predated the digital age by 30 years. Observer, that was the word the 4th woman used. Not sniper, not infiltration specialist, not asset. Observer. The job description, such as it was, could be summarized in one sentence. Watch the people who do not know they are being watched, understand their world better than they understand it themselves, and intervene in ways that cannot be attributed, traced, or acknowledged. The intervention part was new. Elena had not started there. She had started somewhere very different 6 years ago in a village in a country she was not allowed to name beside a man named Thomas Reyes, who had been her partner. Her trainer, the person who had taught her that invisibility was not a trick or a technique. It was a discipline of the self, a complete and ongoing erasure of the instinct to be known. Thomas had been the best she had ever seen at it. He had been so good at it that in 11 years of operating in the darkest corners of classified work, no one had ever caught so much as a glimpse of him in the field. He had died saving her life. A structural collapse in a compromised building. A split-second decision, a choice that left him on the wrong side of a weight-bearing wall, while Elena came out the other side. She had heard him shouting at her to run even as the ceiling came down. She had run because those were his orders, and she had been trained to obey orders even when every human instinct screamed to turn back. She had turned back anyway. She had dug for 2 hours with her bare hands. She had found him 6 minutes too late. His last coherent words spoken while she held his head in her lap in the rubble had been a command. Stay dark forever, Elena. Don't let them see you. Don't ever let them see you. She had not known in that moment whether he was talking about the mission or something larger, whether he was telling her how to survive operationally or how to survive grief. She had interpreted it as both. She had been obeying it ever since. The scout to her northwest finished his dried meat and keyed his radio twice a check-in signal, short and routine. A response came back. She noted the frequency pattern, the interval, the fact that the response came from two distinct directions, which meant two separate comm units, which meant the militia element in this sector was larger than the satellite assessment had suggested. She reached into the left pocket of her jacket and removed a small notebook, not digital, not encrypted, just paper and pencil, and made 3 marks. Anyone who found the notebook would see marks that looked like casual doodles, personal shorthand, nothing operational. Elena could reconstruct an entire tactical picture from those marks. She had been doing this long enough that the notation system lived in her hands more than her mind. The sky was beginning to lighten. She had 2 hours before she needed to reposition. She used the time to watch. Derek Holloway woke up at 4:45 with the particular alertness of a man who had trained himself out of grogginess through years of needing to be functional from the first second of consciousness. He lay still for 3 seconds, taking inventory of the darkness, the sounds, the position of his sentries, the weight of the air. Then he sat up and reached for his water. Sergeant Holloway. That was Yates, Marcus Yates, his youngest and most anxious team member, barely 24, and still carrying the hypervigilance of someone who hadn't yet learned to calibrate fear into useful energy. You need to see the grid overlay from last night. Give me 60 seconds, Yates. Sir, the eastern checkpoint, Carver ran the numbers on the militia movement patterns, and there's something wrong. Derek drank his water. He stood. He took exactly 60 seconds. Then he crossed to where Yates was crouched over a tactical map with a red lens flashlight, and he looked at what Carver had marked. James Carver was the platoon's intelligence specialist, which in practical terms meant he was the man who looked at patterns and told other men what those patterns meant. He was 31, quiet, enormously competent, and deeply distrustful of anything that looked too clean. He had been in the field for 9 days with the same expression. The expression of a man who suspects a joke is being played on him, but hasn't found the punchline yet. The Oasis, Carver said, not looking up. Militia element was setting up there yesterday afternoon. 6 men, at least 2 support weapons, good angle on the northern approach. He paused. This morning, nothing. They're gone. Pulled back. No movement on any of the observation points. No tracks heading out. No radio traffic we can attribute to a withdrawal. They were there, and then they just weren't. Carver looked up then, and his expression was precisely the one Derek had expected, the one that said the punchline was still missing. This is the 4th time in 9 days, Sergeant. Threats that should have materialized and didn't. Ambush positions that get set up and then abandoned. Yesterday, Reeves swore he saw a laser-ranging glint from the western ridge, but there was nothing there when he checked. Reeves sees things. Reeves sees things that are usually there. Carver set down his pencil. Something is managing our threat environment, Sergeant. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a friendly asset we weren't briefed on or something else entirely. But 11 men have been operational in hostile terrain for 9 days, and we have not sustained a single casualty in this sector against this opposition density. He let that sit for a moment. That is not normal. Derek looked at the map for a long time without speaking. Are you telling me, he said finally, that someone is running interference for us and didn't bother to mention it? I'm telling you the math doesn't work any other way. Around them, the rest of the platoon was waking up the quiet, efficient rustling of men who had learned to begin their day without speaking above a murmur, without making unnecessary sound, without doing anything that wasn't purposeful. Derek watched them and thought about what Carver had just said and felt the specific discomfort of a man who is very good at his job and has just been told that something else is doing part of his job for him without asking permission. Keep watching, he said. Note everything. We're not changing anything based on a theory. Carver nodded. He had expected exactly that response, and he agreed with it. But his eyes, when they returned to the map, had not stopped carrying that unsettled expression. Elena's first real test of the mission had come on day 3. She had identified the ambush 12 hours before it was set to occur, a militia element of 8 men coordinating through a cellular relay moving into position along a dry riverbed that the SEAL platoon was scheduled to cross at dawn. The ambush was well planned. The angles were good, the timing was good, the retreat route was covered. Against any standard patrol, it would have been devastating. Elena had spent those 12 hours thinking about Thomas. He had told her once early in her training, when she was still struggling with the psychological weight of what the work actually required, that the hardest part was never the technical execution. The hardest part was the decision architecture. Knowing when to act and when not to act. Knowing how much to give and how much to withhold. Knowing that intervention always has a cost, always leaves a trace, always risks unraveling the invisibility that makes intervention possible in the first place. Every time you touch the world, Thomas had said, the world has a chance to see your fingerprints. She had thought about that for 12 hours, watching the militia element move into position, counting their weapons, mapping their fields of fire, calculating the angles and distances, with the calm precision of a person who has done it so many times that it feels less like analysis and more like reading. And then she had made a decision. The militia element had a single sniper holding the high point, a lean man with a Dragunov who was good enough to be genuinely dangerous and positioned well enough to cover the only viable countermeasure angle. She had ranged him at 640 meters. She had studied his position, his habits, the way he settled into his scope, the micro-adjustments he made when his breathing wasn't controlled. She had not shot him, she had shot his rifle. One round placed with the kind of patience that takes years to build into the receiver assembly of the Dragunov at 640 meters, while the man's hands were away from it. The rifle was destroyed, the man was unharmed, and the ambush, when it materialized the next morning, was missing its overwatch element, and therefore missing its tactical coherence. And the SEAL platoon had crossed the dry riverbed without incident, while the militia element, confused and exposed, and without their sniper anchor, had pulled back. Rather than commit to an engagement, they were no longer configured to win. No one knew what had happened to the rifle. The militia element believed it had been defective. One of them had spent an hour trying to understand the damage before concluding that the receiver had somehow failed. There were arguments. There was blame. The tactical window had closed. 11 SEALs had crossed the riverbed. Elena had watched from the eastern ridge and let herself breathe. Something disabled that Dragunov, said the man who would eventually come to be the greatest threat Elena had ever faced, though he did not yet know that was what he was becoming. Victor Nett said it to no one in particular. He was sitting in the back of an armored vehicle 3 days' distance from the oasis, reading a field report that had been forwarded to him through intermediaries, and the sentence about the destroyed rifle had stopped him the way a wrong note stops a musician. Not as an emergency, but as an anomaly that the trained mind simply cannot pass over. Single round, he said still to no one. The driver ignored him. The driver had learned in 3 weeks of working with Victor that most of what Victor said aloud was part of a thinking process that did not require participation. From distance, no kill, targeted the weapon, not the operator. He set the report down on his knee and looked out the window at the desert passing outside. That's a choice. That's a very specific and deliberate choice. Victor Nett was 53 years old. He had spent 30 of those years working in a professional capacity that did not appear in any publicly accessible record, and that he described on the rare occasions when he described it at all as consultation. He was not especially large or especially frightening in appearance. He had a mild-faced, pale blue eyes that moved slowly and saw everything, and hands that were always very still. He had been hired by the militia network through 3 layers of financial and organizational insulation to solve a problem that the militia network could not solve themselves. The problem was simple. Their operations in this sector kept failing. Ambushes dissolved. Surveillance positions were compromised. Equipment failed under suspicious circumstances. Men who should have had tactical advantages found themselves without them, and they could not explain why. Victor had read the after-action reports. He had read them all. He had noted the pattern that Carver had noted from the other side, the invisible hand, adjusting the environment, removing threats before they could materialize, operating at a level of technical sophistication and restraint that ruled out most explanations. Not a drone program. The signature was wrong, too precise, too conservative, too willing to leave things alive rather than destroy them. Not a standard surveillance asset. The interventions required physical proximity and physical action. A person. One person he believed, though he allowed for the possibility of two. Someone extraordinarily skilled and extraordinarily disciplined. Someone who understood desert terrain at a molecular level. Someone who had been invisible for long enough that invisibility was no longer a tactic, it was a nature. He had encountered that kind before, once in his career. A man named Reyes who had been the best he had ever come across, a ghost who moved through operational environments, leaving nothing. Taking nothing, touching only what needed to be touched. Reyes had been dead for 6 years. Victor had read that file too. He had read the incident report, the classified assessment, the sparse and carefully worded notation that suggested a survivor, though the record was incomplete in ways that felt deliberate rather than accidental. He turned the thought over slowly, like a stone in a hand. A survivor, trained by Reyes, operating alone in the field in the same mode. How long to the forward position, he asked the driver. 4 hours, maybe 5. Victor nodded. He picked up the field report again and read it from the beginning, very slowly, the way he read everything, looking not for what it said, but for what it was trying not to say. Elena had not slept in 31 hours when she found the second surveillance element. She was moving through a sector she had already cleared twice following a repositioning route she had selected for its combination of thermal concealment and sightline coverage when she registered the anomaly. It was small, a compression in the sand that should not have been there given the wind direction, a patch of ground cover that was slightly too uniform, a negative space where there should have been the ambient, micro-disturbance of normal desert ecology. She stopped. She did not look at it directly. She let her gaze drift past it, tracking across the ridgeline above, as though she had not noticed anything. And in her peripheral vision, she assembled the information with the patience of a person who has learned that the fastest way to confirm a threat is to pretend you haven't seen it. 2 men, belly down in a prepared hide, good discipline, good camouflage. Not militia. Militia didn't have this kind of patience or this kind of gear. These were professionals. Someone had sent professionals. She withdrew by millimeters, making herself into landscape, letting distance grow between her and the hide, with the glacial slowness of a person who knows that any movement faster than natural is visible to anyone watching carefully enough. When she was 200 meters back and behind a natural terrain fold, she stopped and let herself think. Professionals changed the equation. Professionals meant she was no longer operating in an environment where the primary threat was volume and energy. Militia, who were dangerous because of numbers and aggression. Professionals meant someone had identified that something unusual was happening in this sector and had sent a response calibrated to that unusual thing. They had sent a counter. She did not know yet who the counter was. She did not know the name Victor Ned or the reputation that name carried in the narrowest and most classified corridors of the world she had once inhabited more fully. She only knew that the hide she had just identified represented a qualitative shift in her operational environment, and that qualitative shifts required reassessment. She found a position 260 meters from the hide above and behind, with a sight line that let her watch without being on the same visual plane as anyone observing from below. She settled in. She waited. 40 minutes later, the first man raised his head. He had a face she did not recognize. He was scanning with slow, methodical sweeps, not looking for movement, she realized, but looking for absence of movement, looking for the thing that didn't disturb the environment the way everything else did, looking for stillness that was too deliberate, looking for her. Her chest was very tight. She had not been looked for in 6 years. She had moved through operation after operation as something the environment around her did not register, and the absence of recognition had been both her greatest protection, and she had understood only slowly a source of loss so deep she had stopped examining it. Now something was looking for her. She watched the man scan. She watched him miss her because she was positioned outside the arc he had determined was most probable, because she had learned Thomas's lessons thoroughly enough to account for what a skilled observer would expect, and to be somewhere else instead. But she watched him with a new kind of attention, the attention you give to something that is genuinely dangerous, something that changes the nature of the problem. She had kept 11 men alive for 9 days by being nothing. Someone had noticed that they were staying alive, and that someone had sent a person whose entire purpose was to find the nothing. Back at the SEAL position, the morning briefing was tighter than usual. Derek had spent 40 minutes with Carver going over every incident from the past 9 days, every position that had dissolved, every threat that had not materialized, every moment of luck that Carver kept refusing to call luck. If it's a friendly asset, Reeves said from the back of the group, why didn't they brief us? Because they didn't want us to change our behavior, Carver said. That's a hell of an assumption. It's the only assumption that explains why an asset with that capability is being used to manage our threat environment, rather than prosecute targets directly. Whoever this is, they're optimizing for our survival, not for operational outcomes in the broader sense. Carver paused. That's a very specific mandate. That's not something you give a general asset. That's something you give someone who's been specifically tasked to keep us alive. The room was quiet. Derek looked at each of his men in turn. He had 11 of them, ranging from Yates at 24 to Morales at 38, and every one of them had a family, a history, a reason they needed to come home. He thought about that a lot, not in the field, because in the field that kind of thinking was a liability. But in the margins, in the moments between, he thought about what each of them meant to someone else. 11 men. Something had decided that 11 men mattered. We operate as normal, he said. We don't go looking for whatever this is. We don't change our patterns. We don't signal. If there's an asset out there protecting us, the worst thing we can do is compromise their position by acting like we know they're there. And if we make contact, Reeves asked. Derek considered the question for a long moment. Then we find out who's been keeping us alive, he said, and we say thank you. Elena was 400 meters east and had no idea she had just been in some oblique and unknowing way thanked in advance. She was watching Victor and Ned's surveillance team continue their sweep. The first man had been joined by the second, and now both of them were working outward from the hide in expanding arcs, looking for trace, looking for sign, looking for the microscopic evidence that a human presence leaves even when that presence is doing everything right. She watched them find nothing. She watched them find nothing because she was not where they were looking, and she was not where they were looking because she had spent 6 years developing an understanding of how skilled professionals think, what assumptions they carry, what patterns they fall into, what the human mind defaults to when it's searching for something that doesn't want to be found. Thomas had taught her the foundations of it. The 6 years had built everything on top. But watching the two men work, watching the methodical competence of their search, the quiet communication between them, the way they adapted their pattern when the first pass came up empty. Elena felt something she had not felt in a very long time. The faint, cold recognition of a worthy opponent. Not because she was afraid of being found, not yet. Not by these two, not in this moment, but because someone had looked at the evidence of what she was doing and had sent a calibrated response. Someone had understood the shape of the problem well enough to know that the solution required a very particular kind of person. Someone knew her world. She reached for her notebook, made 3 new marks. Then she began quietly and methodically to plan for the possibility that Victor Ned, whose name she still did not know, whose face she had not yet seen, whose reputation she had no reason yet to fear, was precisely as dangerous as the care of his team's work suggested. The desert held its silence around her. The sky above turned from gray to bronze to pale burning blue. 11 SEALs 2 kilometers east finished their morning brief and moved to their positions and continued surviving. Continued surviving in ways they could not explain and had stopped trying to. And the invisible thread that connected their survival to the woman 400 meters away, watching 2 professionals search an empty desert for her fingerprints, was so thin, so taut, so deeply buried in the weight of 6 years of discipline and loss in a dead man's last command, that it would have taken someone extraordinary to see it. Victor Net was exactly that extraordinary, and he was already, though neither of them knew it yet, beginning to see. The 2 men searching the desert found nothing because Elena had already decided they would find nothing. And Elena's decisions in the field had the quality of physical law, not because she was infallible, but because she understood that in this kind of work, the difference between a decision and an outcome was simply preparation depth. She had prepared deeper than they were looking. She watched them finish their sweep. She watched them return to the hide. She watched one of them key a radio speak briefly, listen, then nod to the other. They began breaking down the position with the quiet efficiency of professionals who do not need to discuss what they are doing because they have done it many times before. Then they moved northwest, not back the way they had come, northwest toward the SEAL platoon's primary water source. Elena was already moving before she had consciously made the decision to move. This was something Thomas had tried to explain to her early in her training, and that she had not fully understood until the third year, the way that at a certain depth of experience, the body begins acting on pattern recognition before the analytical mind catches up. He had called it operational instinct, but that was too clean a word for what it actually felt like. What it actually felt like was being pulled. A thread attached somewhere behind the sternum, tugging in a direction that the slower parts of the brain were still busy calculating. She moved northwest at an angle that kept the two professionals outside her sightline, without putting her outside theirs, a geometry of concealment that required her to hold two moving spatial models in her head simultaneously while maintaining zero noise signature across ground that alternated between loose gravel and packed sand with the unpredictability of a surface designed specifically to betray you. She had been doing it for 6 years. Her breathing stayed even. Her footfalls were placed rather than taken, each one a small decision, not a mechanical repetition. She crossed 200 meters in 11 minutes. 11 minutes in which the sky continued its slow, bright burn, and the desert continued its pretense of emptiness, and two professional scouts continued moving toward a water source where at roughly 0902 members of the SEAL platoon would arrive to top off the group's supply containers. She knew the schedule because she had memorized the schedule on day 2. She knew which two SEALs would make the water run because she had mapped their rotation well enough to project it 4 days forward with reasonable confidence. She knew the angle of approach they would use and the position they would take while one filled containers and the other held security, because she had watched them do it twice before, and men under operational pressure develop habits faster than they realize, and those habits are visible to anyone paying attention. The two scouts were also paying attention. That was the problem. She found a position on a fractured limestone shelf 60 meters above and northeast of the water source, settled into it and waited. Her heart rate was 104 beats per minute, elevated but controlled. She noted it the way she noted everything, with the detached observational precision of someone who has learned to treat her own body as a piece of equipment to be monitored rather than a self to be experienced. Thomas had said that too once. She had argued with him about it for 40 minutes and then spent the next 6 years discovering he was right. Below her, the two scouts reached the water source. They did not go to it. They went around it, establishing a wide perimeter position that covered the 3 most likely approach angles. Good. Discipline. The kind of positioning that said these men understood that the asset they were hunting might also be hunting them, and they had adjusted their behavior accordingly. The thread behind her sternum pulled harder. At 0847, she heard the footsteps of the two SEALs. She identified them by gait before she saw them. Reeves' long stride with a slight weight bias to the left from an old ankle injury he had never fully rehabilitated. And a younger man she had been thinking of as Boots because he had the walk of someone still adjusting to the weight of his own gear. She did not know his name. She did not need his name. She needed his position and his direction and his likely behavior under stress, and she had all 3. Reeves was carrying 4 containers. Boots had his rifle up. They came in clean. Reeves went to the water. Boots held the southern approach. The scouts were on the eastern side. Elena had 3 seconds to make a decision, and the decision was this. She could intervene, signal the SEALs, create a distraction force, a change in the tactical geometry, and in doing so, she would almost certainly compromise her position to the scouts, who were professional enough to read a distraction for what it was. Or she could do nothing and trust that the scouts were operating in observation mode rather than interdiction mode, that their purpose in this position was intelligence gathering rather than action, and that Reeves and Boots would fill their containers and leave before the scouts decided to shift from watching to acting. She chose to do nothing. She chose it in 2 seconds flat, which was 2 seconds more than Thomas had ever needed for the same kind of calculation, and she spent the 3rd second hating him a little for that. Reeves filled containers. Boots watched the south. The scouts watched everything and did not move. 14 minutes later, Reeves and Boots were gone. Elena let out a breath that she had not fully allowed herself to take in while they were there, and she recalculated everything. The scouts had intelligence now. They had confirmed the platoon's water schedule and approach pattern. That information would go back to whoever had sent them, and whoever had sent them would use it to plan something that the platoon's current defensive posture was not configured to handle. She had, until that information reached its destination, to decide what to do about it. The thread pulled. She moved. She was below and behind the scout's position in 19 minutes below, because the wind was carrying away from the position behind, because it was the angle that their setup was least optimized to cover. And both of those facts were things she had worked out on the move, adjusting her route in real time the way a chess player adjusts their line when the opponent makes an unexpected move. She was 12 meters from the nearer scout when she stopped. She could hear his breathing. This was the closest she had been to another human being in 11 days, and the proximity had a physical quality, a warmth in the air, a subtle organic disturbance in the desert's sterile stillness, the almost inaudible sound of a living body processing oxygen and effort and mild anxiety. She had been alone for so long that the nearness of another person felt like standing too close to a fire. Not dangerous, just overwhelming in its intensity. She steadied. She looked at the radio on his vest. She needed that radio out of commission before he used it. The method she chose was the same one she always chose when given options, the one least likely to leave a recoverable signature. Not the radio itself, the power cell. She could not reach it from here. She needed him to move. She picked up a small piece of gypsum from the ground beside her right hand and placed it, not through, placed rolling it along the ground with a controlled release that produced the minimal possible sound 3 meters to the scout's left. The scout turned, his partner turned. In the 2 seconds they were both oriented away from her, she covered the distance to the nearer pack, found the external battery pouch by touch, removed the power cell, and was back in her original position before the scouts had finished processing the sound. The nearer scout checked the ground to his left, found nothing, said something quiet to his partner in a language Elena recognized as a regional dialect she had spent 4 months studying 3 years ago. The partner shrugged. 12 minutes later, the nearer scout tried to transmit. Nothing. He checked the radio, checked the connections, swapped to his partner's unit and tried again. That one worked. He began transmitting. Elena was already repositioning because she had anticipated this one radio disabled, still left one operational, and she had removed the power cell not to prevent communication but to delay it, to create a window in which she could move to a position that gave her options for the next step. She found that position a rocky depression 40 meters northwest and listened. The transmission was brief. Confirmation of the platoon's water schedule, the approach pattern, a description of the terrain. Professional and concise. The response was equally brief. She caught 3 words in the response that she understood. 2 of them were positional coordinates. One of them was a name, Victor. She lay in the rocky depression with that name sitting in her chest like a stone, and she understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the person who had sent the scouts was now within the operational theater, not days away, not directing from a distance, but close enough that his people were reporting to him directly. The second was that a person whose operation was organized this efficiently, whose people were this disciplined, whose response time was this short, was not an opponent she could manage through the same methods she had been using for the past 9 days. She would have to change her approach. She was not sure yet what the new approach looked like. She reached for her notebook and made marks that meant coordinates, proximity, accelerated threat assessment, and name. And then she lay still in the depression and let herself think, which was a thing she had learned to do, without moving, without visible signs of thought, because in her world, the act of thinking openly was itself a vulnerability. Derek Holloway was conducting his 4th grid review of the morning when Reeves and Boots came back from the water run. Anything? Derek asked. Clean, Reeves said. He set the containers down and looked at Derek with the expression of a man who has something to add but is deciding whether to add it. Almost too clean. Define too clean. Eastern approach had compression marks. Not from today, from earlier this morning before we got there. Someone was sitting the position before we arrived. Reeves paused. Not militia, wrong boot pattern, wrong weight distribution. These were pros. The briefing room, such as it was a tarpaulin-shaded corner of the position, went quiet. Carver looked up from his map. How many 2 sets of tracks? Both pro, watching the water source. Reeves met Derek's eyes. They let us go. They let you go, Derek repeated. Containers full, both of us upright, no contact. Either they weren't ready or they were only watching. He paused again. Or something kept them from acting. Carver set his pencil down very carefully. Our invisible friend, he said. No one argued with it. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms get quiet when a group of people all arrive at the same conclusion at the same time, and no one particularly wants to be the first to say it out loud. Derek looked at each of his men. He looked at Boots, who was 26 years old and had a photograph of his daughter taped inside his helmet. He looked at Reeves, who was 34 and had been in this kind of country 3 times before and knew better than most how wrong things could go. He looked at Morales, who was 38 and had a wife who called herself a military widow, even though her husband was still alive because she said, the man who came home was never quite the same man who left. 11 men. We tighten the water rotation, Derek said. 2 additional security. We vary the timing, vary the approach. And someone tracks those scout positions. If there are 2 of them, there are more. If there are more, Carver said carefully, it means whoever sent them is escalating. Whoever is watching us got confirmation that something is running interference, and they responded by upgrading their asset package. He looked at Derek, which means the interference is no longer invisible to them. The implication hung in the air. The thing that had been keeping them alive was now itself being hunted. Derek thought about the compass that he kept in his left breast pocket, the one his father had given him, engraved with the family name and worn smooth by 30 years of handling before it had passed to Derek and begun wearing smooth again. He reached up and touched it through the fabric of his jacket without thinking. Then we make sure we're doing our job well enough that it doesn't have to work as hard, he said. Whatever is out there, whoever it is, I won't have their blood on my hands because my platoon was sloppy. Yates, who had been quiet through all of this, said, do you think it's a person? Everyone looked at him. I mean, he stopped, recalibrated. Someone's been running this whole thing for 9 days alone. That's what we're saying, one person. I think it's a person, Carver said quietly. The choices are too specific for a system. A system optimizes for outcomes. This, whatever this is optimizing for us specifically. For these 11 men. He paused. That's personal. Victor Nen arrived at the forward position at 1340. He arrived the way he always arrived, without announcement, without drama, with the quiet purposefulness of a man for whom every movement is a conservation of energy. He spoke to the 2 scouts for 6 minutes. He read their written report for 4 more. Then he went to the edge of the position and looked out at the desert and was still for a long time. One of the scouts, the younger one who had been working with Victor for 14 months and had not yet fully understood him, came to stand nearby. The radio failure, Victor said without turning. Where exactly? The scout pointed. Eastern water position. The cell was removed from the external pouch. Not lost, removed. No damage to the pouch itself. Removed quietly, without us noticing. Victor was quiet again. The younger scout had learned that this kind of silence was not a pause. It was a calculation and interrupting. It was the same as interrupting a surgeon mid-procedure. He waited. Thomas Reyes trained someone, Victor said at last, before he died. He said it the way you say a fact that you have known for a long time and have been waiting to have confirmed. Someone who learned from him long enough to absorb his method entirely and then had 6 years alone to refine it. You think it's one of his people? I think it's his person. Victor turned. His pale blue eyes had the quality they always had when he was fully engaged, not cold exactly, but still the way very deep water is still. There was one name in the file that the damage assessment couldn't account for. A survivor, listed as, he stopped, reconsidered the word, chose a different one as absent, not deceased, absent. The scout waited. The rifle at the oasis, Victor said, 640 meters, receiver assembly, 1 round. He paused. Thomas Reyes taught his people to take weapons, not lives, when lives weren't necessary. That was his philosophy. That was his signature. He looked back at the desert. She's been here since before we arrived. She knows this terrain better than we do. She knows our patterns. Another pause, longer this time. She's been watching us the same way she's been watching the seals. Then we change our patterns. No, Victor said it with a quiet finality that closed the conversation. If we change our patterns, she knows we've identified her, she adjusts, she disappears into something deeper, and we lose her entirely. He picked up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers, watching the way it fell. We give her a reason to come out. What reason? Victor set down the last of the sand. We give her something she can't ignore, he said. We threaten something she's decided to protect. Elena found the third surveillance element at 1510. She found them because she was looking for them because the name in the radio transmission had recalibrated her threat model completely, and a recalibrated threat model means looking in places your previous model hadn't accounted for. She found them on the southern ridge, well-positioned, covering an angle that the scouts from the water source had not covered. Triangulation. Victor was building a net. She counted 4 men this time, not 2. He had doubled the field assets since the morning. She lay flat on the ground behind a low thermal irregularity and did the mathematics of her situation with the same cold clarity she had been trained to apply and had been applying for 6 years, and what the mathematics told her was not comfortable. She had 12 effective operational hours before the SEAL platoon's extraction window opened. 12 hours in which she needed to maintain a threat environment clear enough for 11 men to reach the extraction point without becoming casualties while simultaneously managing a counter-sniper operation that was now resourced at a level she had not encountered since before Thomas died. Since the days when she and Thomas had operated together and 2 people carrying his methodology were enough to handle almost anything. 1 person carrying his methodology. 12 hours. 4 new assets on the southern ridge plus the 2 from the water source plus whatever else Victor had positioned that she hadn't found yet. She made marks in her notebook. She counted her ammunition. She ran her equipment inventory in her head, cataloging each item with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of someone assessing tools rather than possessions. Scope rifle sidearm, 2 days' worth of water, emergency trauma kit communications device she had not activated in 11 days. Her extraction beacon, which she could trigger at any point, and which would bring a vehicle within 4 hours, but which would also immediately and unambiguously reveal her position to anyone monitoring the appropriate frequencies. She had not triggered it. She was not going to trigger it, not for 12 more hours. The sun was moving across the sky at its usual indifferent pace, burning the desert with the cheerful brutality of something that has no opinions about what happens below it. And Elena pressed herself into the ground and watched the 4 men on the southern ridge and thought about Thomas, which she did not usually allow herself to do in the field because grief, even very controlled and quiet grief, uses cognitive resources that the field requires for other purposes. She thought about him anyway. She thought about the way he had looked at her 3 months into her training when she had managed for the first time to move through a monitored environment without triggering a single sensor or drawing a single eye. He had said nothing. He had simply looked at her for a long moment with an expression that contained something she had not been able to name at the time and that she had been naming and renaming ever since pride, she thought, but not the ordinary kind. The kind that looks like recognition. The kind that says, I see you becoming something real. She wanted to be that thing. She still wanted it. In 11 days of silence and sand, in the exhausting machinery of keeping 11 strangers alive, without their knowledge, she still wanted to be the thing Thomas had seen her becoming. She pressed her forehead briefly against the warm ground. Then she raised her head, checked the position of the 4 men on the ridge, noted that 2 of them were now looking in a different direction than the other 2, which meant their surveillance field had a seam, and began calculating how to use that seam. Victor was building a net. Elena had spent 6 years learning to move through nets. The question that had no comfortable answer, the question she was going to have to answer over the next 12 hours regardless of its comfort, was whether this particular net built by this particular person was one she could move through alone. She thought about 11 men 2 kilometers east. She thought about Reeves and his old ankle injury and his careful eyes. She thought about Boots and the photograph inside the helmet she had never been close enough to see, but had inferred from the way he touched the helmet's rim, sometimes a small, unconscious gesture, the way people touch the things that carry the images of people they love. She thought about Derek Holloway, who she had been watching longer than any of the others, whose leadership style she had studied, the way she studied terrain, whose habits she had memorized, whose voice she sometimes caught fragments of in the wind when conditions were right. Not the words, but the tone, the particular quality of a man who carries his responsibility to his weight rather than authority. She did not know his name. She would never know his name. She was not supposed to know his name. That was the job. That was the entirety of the job. Invisible, present, sufficient. She rolled carefully to her right, found a new position angle, and brought the 4 men on the southern ridge back into her sight line. Victor was building a net. She began with the patient and precise attention of someone who has accepted that patience and precision are the only tools available to her to find its edges. 12 hours, 11 men, one woman who did not exist. The desert held all of them in its vast and indifferent embrace, and somewhere in the complicated silence between those facts, a clock was running, had been running since the morning had been running since the name Victor had come across a broken radio frequency and landed in Elena's chest like a stone. And it was running faster now with the particular acceleration that happens when two people of equivalent skill finally understand that they are playing the same game. She had been invisible for 6 years. She needed 12 more hours. She was no longer certain she was going to get them. The seam in Victor's net was 17 degrees wide and lasted approximately 4 minutes every hour, the window created when the two northern scouts rotated their observation arc and the southern element hadn't yet compensated. Elena had mapped it through 2 full rotation cycles before she trusted it enough to move through it, and even then she moved as though the seam might close on her, slow and deliberate and absolutely silent, covering ground that should have taken 90 seconds in 4.5 minutes, because 4.5 minutes of invisible movement was worth more than 90 seconds of movement that left any question at all. She was through by 16:18. She stopped on the far side of a low ridge and did a full inventory check by touch. Rifle sidearm, waterarm, trauma kit, notebook. The way pilots do pre-flight checks, not because they doubt the equipment, but because the ritual of checking is itself a form of focus, a way of arriving fully in the present moment rather than carrying the weight of the past one. 8 hours and 40 minutes. She reset her internal clock and moved northeast. The SEAL platoon's extraction was scheduled for 0300. Between now and then, she had identified 4 discrete threat windows periods when the platoon's movement patterns would intersect with militia observation points in ways that Victor's network could exploit if he chose to. She had already neutralized 2 of them. The remaining 2 required her to cover ground she had not fully pre-surveyed, which meant operating on real-time assessment rather than prepared intelligence, which was the operational equivalent of driving at night with the headlights off. You could do it. Thomas had taught her to do it, but the margin for error contracted to something that had no comfortable name. She was 300 meters into the new ground when she found Victor's trap. She found it not because she saw it, but because she felt it, that same thread behind the sternum tension that had been her most reliable warning system for 6 years. Everything in front of her was correct. The terrain was undisturbed. The ambient sound signature was normal. The wind was clean, nothing was wrong. Everything being correct was what was wrong. In terrain this active, with this many assets moving through it, there should have been micro-disturbances. Compressed sand, disturbed gravel, the faint displacement of ground cover that even the most careful movement leaves behind. The absence of those signs was itself a sign, the sign of a position that had been prepared in advance and then left deliberately clean, maintained by someone who understood that a trap's greatest virtue is that it looks like nothing. She stopped. She did not move for 6 minutes. Then she began reading the nothing with the slow, comprehensive attention she gave to everything, looking for the edges of the clean zone, the boundary where the deliberate stillness gave way to the ordinary randomness of undisturbed terrain. She found the boundary at 11 meters to her left and 23 meters ahead. Rectangular, intentional. Someone was inside that rectangle. Not militia, not the scouts she had seen. This was a single position, single operator, and the discipline of it was absolute. No thermal variance she could detect. No sound, no movement. Victor. She did not know it with certainty. She felt it with the specific quality of recognition that comes when you have been studying someone's methodology all day and then encounter that methodology expressed at its highest level. The water source position had been competent. The triangulated net had been sophisticated. This invisible rectangle of prepared nothing was something else. This was the work of someone operating at the same depth she operated at. For the first time in 6 years, she was not the most invisible person in the desert. She did not move for another 4 minutes. She used those 4 minutes to accept that fact, to let it settle through her without fighting it the way Thomas had taught her, to absorb bad information completely and immediately without the waste of wishing it were otherwise. The situation was what it was. Victor was between her and the route she needed to take. He had positioned himself there deliberately, which meant he had anticipated her next move, which meant his model of her behavior was better than she had understood it to be. She reassessed. She could go around a long arc 40 minutes that would take her outside the window she needed. She could wait, but waiting gave him time to refine his position and narrow her remaining options. Or she could go over above his position using the ridge to her right, which was exposed and would require her to cross 70 meters of open ground with the sun still high enough to create a shadow, which was the kind of move Thomas would have told her never to make. She went over. She went over because it was the move Victor would least expect from someone trained the way she was trained, and in a confrontation between equally skilled opponents, the only reliable advantage is the move the other person has decided you won't make. She crossed the 70 meters in the shadow of her own body, using the ridge's contour to break her silhouette, moving at a pace that turned her into a natural feature of the landscape, not fast enough to draw the eye, not still enough to hold it. She felt exposed in a way she had not felt since the early months of her training, when she had not yet developed the ability to detach sensation from assessment. The exposure sat on her skin like heat. She made it to the far side in 11 minutes. She exhaled, waited. Nothing moved below. Victor had not seen her, or he had seen her and was choosing not to react. She could not tell the difference, and not being able to tell the difference was its own kind of information. Glad. At 17:24, Derek made a decision that had been building for 3 days. "I'm going back to the water source," he said. Carver looked up. "That's not on the schedule." "No, it's not." Derek was already checking his gear, the careful automatic movements of a man who has decided something and is letting his hands implement it while his mind stays a step ahead. "Someone watched Reeves in boots this morning and let them walk. I want to understand why." "You want to make contact." "I want to create the possibility of contact. There's a difference." Derek paused. "If there's an asset out there that's been keeping us alive for 11 days, they deserve to know we know. They deserve to not be alone in this." Carver was quiet for a moment. "Sergeant, if they've been operating dark for this long, making contact might be the last thing they want. That's their call to make, not mine." He met Carver's eyes. "I'm going alone. 1 hour. If I'm not back, you assume I've been compromised and you accelerate the extraction timeline." "Derek, I need you to run this platoon if I don't come back, James." He used Carver's first name, which he almost never did in the field, and Carver heard the weight of it. "You're the only one I trust to do that right." Carver held his gaze for a long moment. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour, and then I come looking." 1 hour, Derek agreed. He left at 17:31. Yeah. Elena heard him coming. She heard him from 200 meters because he was not trying to be silent. A deliberate choice, she realized immediately, which changed the classification of his approach from threat to something else. He was moving with purpose, but without concealment, the footfalls of a man who wants to be heard, who is presenting himself openly in a situation where openness is a form of communication. She watched him arrive at the water source from a position 20 meters above and northeast. He stood at the edge of it and looked around with the unhurried attention of a man who is looking for something he knows is there, even if he can't see it. Then he spoke to the desert. "I know you're out there," he said, not loudly, the measured, clear voice of someone used to being heard under difficult conditions. "I'm not here to compromise anything. I'm not asking you to show yourself." A pause. "I'm here because 11 men are alive who shouldn't be, and whoever did that, I wanted them to know someone noticed." Elena did not move, did not breathe differently, did not make any response. He stayed. He had expected that. "My name is Derek Holloway," he said, "Staff Sergeant, United States Navy SEALs. Before that, I was a kid from Macon, Georgia, who joined up because my older brother did, and I couldn't think of anything braver to aspire to." Another pause. Longer. "My brother didn't come back, but I have 4 times, and I've got 11 men who need to come back 1 more time." Elena watched him from above and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have words for. It was not sentiment. She had been too long in this work for uncomplicated sentiment. It was more precise than that. It was the sensation of being addressed by someone who understood that they were addressing a person rather than an asset. "I found the position on the eastern ridge this morning," Derek continued, "where you were watching from. I reconstructed what you must have seen and when you must have seen it. You had 12 hours warning on that ambush at the dry riverbed. He stopped, started again. You chose to stay hidden. You could have warned us. You chose to handle it yourself so we wouldn't know you were there. He was quiet. That's not operational protocol. That's a philosophy. She had not expected him to understand that. She had expected him to find the position to reconstruct the shooting angle to confirm his theory that someone was running interference. She had not expected him to look at the choice she had made and understand what kind of choice it was. I don't know if you can hear me, he said. I don't know if you're 3 miles away or 3 meters, but I'm going to say this anyway because it needs to be said. He looked at the ground, he looked at the sky, he looked at the desert surrounding him with the honest, uncomfortable directness of a man who has learned that the desert has no use for performance. Thank you. From me. From all of them, even if they don't know who they're thanking. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed something. Set it on a flat rock at the edge of the water. Whatever your mission is, whatever it cost you, thank you. He turned and walked back the way he had come. Elena stayed in her position for 3 full minutes after he was gone. Then she moved to the flat rock and picked up what he had left. A compass. Military issue, well-worn, the kind that has lived in a pocket long enough to absorb the warmth of the body that carries it. She turned it over. On the back, engraved in letters so small she had to hold it close to the guardian, Isaiah 6:8. She held it in both hands and said nothing, and felt the pressure behind her eyes that she had been managing for 6 years with the same quiet, relentless discipline she applied to everything else. She put it in her breast pocket and moved back into position. 8 minutes later, Victor made his first active move against the platoon. The trigger was a militia element of 14 men that Victor had been holding in reserve position north of the platoon's extraction corridor since before Elena had arrived in sector place there with the specific purpose of being deployed when the right moment came. Victor had determined the right moment with the efficiency of a person who has done this calculation many times. The asset was somewhere in the northern quadrant. He had been watching for trace all day and had narrowed the probable position to 300 meters of terrain, and the SEAL platoon's 0300 extraction would require them to move through the northern corridor, whether they knew about the militia element or not. His plan was not subtle. Victor was not a man who believed in subtlety when directness served. The militia element would activate at 2100, creating a blocking position across the extraction corridor. The SEALs, encountering an unexpected obstacle 5 hours before extraction, would divert. The diversion would take them into the eastern approach where Victor's scouts were waiting, and the asset, whoever she was, trained by Thomas Reyes and operating alone for 6 years, would have to choose between her invisibility and the 11 lives she had spent 11 days protecting. Victor believed she would choose the lives. He was counting on it. He activated the militia element at 2047, 13 minutes ahead of schedule, because 13 minutes was enough disruption to break any reactive countermeasure that a prepared observer might have built into their planning. Elena heard the activation through the radio frequency she had been monitoring since the morning. She had 43 minutes. She covered 600 meters in 8 minutes a pace that was not sustainable but was not meant to be sustained, designed only to get her into a position from which the next decision was possible. She was breathing hard when she stopped, which she noted, and managed slowing her inhale and extending her exhale with the deliberate control of someone who cannot afford the physiological cost of sustained exertion affecting her fine motor function. The militia element was visible from her new position. 14 men, 2 crews served weapons, moving with the confidence of a unit that expects to reach its objective without opposition. She counted them twice. She checked her ammunition. She did the mathematics. She could not stop 14 men and 2 support weapons without being seen. There was no version of this in which she remained invisible. For a moment, one moment, not longer, she allowed herself to consider the extraction beacon. 4 hours. The platoon was 5 hours from their window. The math almost worked, except that almost was a different word from the one she needed. She put the beacon away. She keyed the one communications device she had carried without activating for 11 days. One channel, emergency only. Phoenix Actual, this is Observer 1, I need fire support reference grid. She read the coordinates from her notebook, the ones she had recorded that morning when she had mapped the militia element's staging position. Activate immediately. 14 hostiles with support weapons moving north toward your extraction corridor. You have 40 minutes, a pause, then observer 1 confirm identity. She gave the code. She had not spoken it in 11 days, and it came out of her mouth like something dug from deep ground, rough-edged and real. Another pause. Identity confirmed. Observer 1 fire support is not available in this window. You are outside coordinated support range. She had already known that. She had hoped she was wrong. Understood, she said. She put the device away. She looked at the 14 men moving north. She looked at her rifle. And she thought about Thomas, who had told her to stay dark forever. And she thought about Derek Holloway, who had stood in the desert and spoken to the empty air about 11 men who needed to come home. And she thought about the compass in her breast pocket, pressing against her sternum, with the warmth of a body that wasn't hers and had been carrying it for longer than she had. She exhaled. She fired. The first round dropped the lead man, non-lethal placement, deliberately chosen, because even now, even in this, she was making choices, and the militia element did what untested units do when fire comes from an unexpected direction. They scattered, which was the wrong response, because scattering gave her 14 separate targets, moving in unpredictable directions, which was vastly more difficult than a coherent formation. But it also broke their cohesion completely and bought the SEAL platoon the 60 seconds it needed to hear the shots and begin responding. She was already moving to the second position by the time she fired the fourth round. She heard the radio traffic spike on the militia frequency. She heard Victor's voice for the first time, and it was quieter than she had expected, precise and unhurried, the voice of a man who was executing a plan. He had already accounted for this possibility. Northern contact, activate eastern element. She's showing herself. He had planned for this. He had planned for her to break cover. The eastern element was already moving. She fired her fifth round, her sixth repositioned, fired her seventh, and then she heard something she had not heard since the desert she had left Thomas in. She heard a shot that was not hers, and she felt the round pass so close that the air displacement moved her hair, and a fraction of a second later, her scope detonated in her eyeline. Not a direct hit, a fragment or a ricochet from the round striking the scope housing, but enough, more than enough. The optics shattering in a single violent moment that left her with blood on her face and one eye that was temporarily unable to tell her anything useful. She went down. Not all the way down, she caught herself on one hand and one knee, a controlled fall. The muscle memory of years of training, refusing to let her hit the ground completely, even when her nervous system was 3 steps behind the situation. She pressed her good eye against the ground and let the pain arrive and process and recede enough to function, which took 8 seconds that felt considerably longer. Victor had seen her. He had not known where she was precisely. If he had known precisely, the round would have been placed differently. But he had known her general position well enough to fire, which meant he had read her shooting pattern from 7 rounds, and back calculated her location with the speed and accuracy of someone who has done exactly this before. She pushed herself upright. Her rifle was functional, the scope was destroyed, but the iron sights were intact, and she was close enough to her remaining targets that iron sights would serve. She did a 3-second damage inventory, one eye clearing, left shoulder, scraped by the fall scope, housing fragments, in the skin above her right on eyebrow. Nothing structural. She could continue. She continued. She fired her 8th round without a scope, and it went where she intended. And somewhere in the part of her brain that was not entirely consumed by the immediate operational calculus, she registered that Thomas would have had something to say about that. He would have said it in that way he had, where the words were dry and understated, and the eyes said everything the voice wasn't saying. She was firing her 9th round when the SEAL platoon's response element reached the northern edge of the fight. She heard Derek Holloway's voice carrying over the radio traffic. Not his words, just the authority of the voice, the specific quality that she had identified at a distance over 11 days and had learned to use as a calibration point. She heard his element make contact with the scattered militia remnants. She heard the fight change shape. And in the space that opened up while the tactical geometry shifted, while the militia element was caught between her position and the platoon response and had to choose which threat to orient toward, she moved. She moved because Victor's round had told her exactly how much he knew about her position, and what it had told her was that she had approximately 90 seconds before he refined the information and fired again. 90 seconds was enough. She covered 140 meters to a terrain fold she had pre-identified that morning, went to ground behind it, and stayed absolutely still. She could hear the fight to her north. She could hear Victor's element moving on the frequency. She could hear barely at the edge of audible something that might have been Victor himself moving, though she could not be certain of the direction. Her breathing was controlled, her hands were steady, the compass pressed against her sternum. The SEAL platoon finished the northern contact in 6 minutes. 2 casualties, non-fatal, she found out later. Every man standing. The extraction corridor was open. Victor had not gotten what he planned for. But Elena was bleeding, operating without an optic, and somewhere in the dark desert around her, Victor Net was reading the ground the way she read the ground, processing the pattern of her 7 shots, the way she processed patterns and building toward a second attempt with the patient, and methodical certainty of a man who has learned that the first attempt in this kind of work is rarely the one that decides anything. She pressed herself against the terrain fold and listened. Victor was out there. She had heard his voice. She knew his name. She had seen enough of his work to understand what he was capable of. And he had seen her shoot. Not her face, not her position, but the expression of her ability. 7 rounds, 7 decisions, each one carrying the specific fingerprint of Thomas Reyes's methodology, adapted and refined over 6 years by the one person he had taught it to completely. Victor had been hunting Thomas's ghost. He had just found out she was real. Derek Holloway got back to the platoon position at 22:14 and did not say a single unnecessary word for the next 4 minutes. He stood inside the perimeter and looked at his 11 men. All 11 of them accounted for the 2 casualties from the northern contact, bandaged and functional. And he felt the weight of that number, the way he always felt it in moments like this, as something physical, something that pressed down on the chest and had to be consciously breathed through. Carver came to stand beside him. "That fight to the north," Carver said quietly. "That wasn't us." "No," Derek said. "The first 8 shots came before we were in position." "Yes." Carver was quiet. "Then she broke cover to give us time." Derek said nothing for a moment. He reached up and touched his breast pocket where the compass usually was, and his hand found nothing, and he remembered that he had left it at the water source, and he felt the absence of it as something specific and complete. "She's still out there," he said. "Injured, probably. Without full equipment." He turned to face Carver directly. "She bought us to the extraction window, James. Whatever it cost her, she bought us to the window. We can't go looking for her. We compromised the corridor." "I know that." "Derek, I know that," he repeated more quietly. "I know exactly what I can and cannot do right now. I know my job." He turned back to look at the desert, the direction the shots had come from, the direction she was. "I'm also going to know for the rest of my life that she was out there when we came home." Carver had no answer for that. Neither did the desert. The clock continued. 5 hours to extraction. 11 men alive. And somewhere in the dark, Elena Castellano pressed her back against the terrain fold with blood drying on her face and a dead scope on her rifle, listening for a man who was now listening for her. And the only sound between them was the sound of a desert that had seen all of this before and intended to keep every secret. The blood above her right eyebrow had stopped flowing and started drying, which meant it was pulling at the skin. When she moved her face, a small, persistent discomfort that she cataloged and filed under irrelevant, alongside the bruised shoulder and the grit in her left eye and the low throb behind her temples that came from sustained adrenaline and not enough water. She had been in worse condition. She had continued from worse condition. The inventory was not a complaint, it was calibration, the same thing she did with her equipment, and the conclusion was the same functional. Continue. She had been still for 19 minutes. Victor had not fired again. That told her something. Not that he had lost her position. She did not make the mistake of comfort, but that he had made the same assessment she would have made in his place. A second shot at a moving, alerted target in low-light conditions with uncertain range and no confirmed sight line was a shot more likely to reveal his own position than to end the engagement. Victor was too good for that. Victor would wait. He would let the dark work for him the way she had let the dark work for her for 6 years, and he would build his next move on better information. She needed to move before he got it. At 2,241, she began repositioning not away from Victor, which would give him the initiative, but laterally parallel to his last known position, keeping constant distance while she changed her angle. She was operating on iron sights with a working eye that was still slightly impaired from the scope fragment impact. She adjusted her internal accuracy margin accordingly. She did not like the adjustment, but she made it without self-pity, because self-pity was Thomas's word for the gap between what the situation is and what you wish it were, and he had trained her to close that gap in the first second or stop functioning. She closed it. She moved. At 22:49, she heard Victor. Not his voice, a sound, one small sound, the kind of sound that should not have been audible at this distance, that was only audible because Elena had been operating in near-complete silence for so long that her hearing had the quality of an instrument tuned beyond its normal range. A displacement of gravel, she thought. A shift of weight. 40 meters southeast, which meant he had moved significantly from his last firing position, which meant he was also repositioning, which meant they were now describing a slow circle around each other in the dark, like two people playing a game with rules only they knew. She stopped. She counted her remaining rounds. She considered options. She thought about Thomas. Thomas had told her once that the only time fear was useful in the field was when it made you faster. Fear that made you slower was the enemy, and the treatment for it was simple and brutal: commit. Whatever the next action was, commit to it completely and immediately, because hesitation in a knife-edge situation produced all the risk of action with none of its benefits. She committed. She changed direction, moving directly toward the sound she had heard, closing distance instead of maintaining it, using the counterintuitive choice the same way she had used it crossing above Victor's prepared position that afternoon. If he was expecting her to hold distance or increase it, she had roughly 30 seconds of positional advantage from moving the wrong way. She covered 20 meters in 62 seconds. She stopped. She was close enough now that she could hear his breathing. He was very controlled, but not as controlled as she was. She had 6 years of practice at being the only living thing in a desert of silence. Victor was good, extraordinarily good, but he had been the hunter for so long that he had not fully developed the particular discipline of being hunted. She had. She set her crosshairs, iron sights, no scope, 14 meters on the point in the dark where the breathing was coming from. She did not fire. She waited. Victor shifted. A micro movement, the kind of movement the body makes when it has been held still so long that the will and the muscles begin negotiating. She saw the shift. She recentered. And then Victor spoke. "I counted your shots," he said. Very quiet, very even. The voice of a man who has decided that silence has stopped being an advantage. 9 rounds, 7 contacts, 2 repositioning signatures. You never fired without a reason. A pause. "Thomas taught you that?" Elena said nothing. "He taught me something similar," Victor continued. "Different school, different methodology, but the principle was the same. Around is a commitment, not a gesture." She heard him breathe. "You're right there. I know you're right there. And you've had at least 2 windows in the last 90 seconds where you could have used one of your remaining rounds on me." Silence. "You chose not to," Victor said, "because killing me creates noise. And noise has a cost, and you have." She heard the precise, almost mechanical quality of a man doing real-time calculation, approximately 4 hours and 8 minutes before those seals reach their extraction window, and you need to get them there more than you need me dead. The fact that he understood her calculus perfectly was the most frightening thing he had said. "My name is Victor Nett," he said. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I was in the field when Thomas Reyes was training you. I know what he built. I know what he was capable of." A pause that had weight to it. "I know what you are." Elena's hand was very steady on the rifle. The iron sight was centered on the approximate position of his voice. She said for the first time in 11 days a word to another human being. "Step back." Her voice was quiet, lower than it had been before, the field roughened by silence and dry air, in the kind of sustained physical effort that changes the texture of a person. But it was steady, and it carried the specific quality that Thomas had worked with her on for months, the quality of a voice that does not ask. "That states." A very long pause. Then she heard him step back. Not retreat, one step deliberate, controlled the movement of a man who is choosing to create space rather than being forced into it. "You kept 9 men alive on my network," he said. "I deployed 14 against a corridor, and you stopped them with 9 rounds in one eye. That's not asset behavior. That's not even specialist behavior." His voice had changed, not softer, but more precise, the way a lens sharpens when it finds the right focal length. That's what Thomas was always trying to build, and never thought he'd finished. She said nothing. I'm going to leave this sector, Victor said. Not because you're pointing a rifle at me, because 11 Americans surviving a desert extraction is not worth what it would cost to push this engagement further. She heard him prepare to move. And because Thomas Reyes deserved to know that what he built worked. He moved. She tracked the sound until it diminished and then disappeared. She stayed in position for 8 full minutes after his footsteps were gone, because Victor Ney was the kind of person who builds false exits, and she was the kind of person who waits 8 minutes to find out. He did not come back. She exhaled. But at 23:18, Derek Holloway was sitting with Carver in the pre-extraction hold when Yates came to find him with an expression that Derek had learned to read the way he read weather, the particular combination of confusion and controlled alarm that meant something had happened that didn't fit any existing category. Northern perimeter, Yates said. Reeves found something. Derek followed him. Reeves was crouched at the edge of the perimeter with a red lens flashlight pointed at a flat rock, and on the flat rock was a folded piece of paper. Derek picked it up. He opened it. It was a hand-drawn map pencil on paper. The notation system unfamiliar but decipherable, the kind of thing drawn by someone who could render spatial information onto a flat surface with the accuracy of a person for whom that rendering was as natural as breathing. The map showed the extraction corridor. It showed 2 positions marked with small X symbols and annotated in a shorthand he couldn't read. And it showed a clear route, the only route he understood as he studied it, that avoided both marked positions and would take the platoon to the extraction window without contact. At the bottom of the map in the same small precise hand were 4 words. Use the eastern line. No name. No identification. Nothing that could be traced or attributed. Derek stared at the 4 words for a long time. She came to the perimeter, Reeves said quietly. He was a man who had seen a great deal and was not easily unsettled. And his voice right now had the quality of a man who is deciding whether what he witnessed counts as something he needs to report. I was at the post. I almost heard something. I looked. There was nothing there. And then when I looked at the rock, he stopped. The paper was on the rock. You heard nothing. I heard almost nothing, Reeves paused, which is not nothing. Derek folded the map carefully. He put it in his breast pocket in the place where the compass had been. Eastern line, he said. We adjust the route. Carver gets the full picture in 5 minutes. He looked at Reeves. And whatever you almost heard at the post, you heard nothing. Clear. Reeves met his eyes. Clear, Sergeant. Elena had reached the Eastern Overwatch position by 2352. She was operating on the last of her water in a body that was sending increasingly direct messages about its need for rest, which she was receiving and setting aside with the same systematic management she had been applying all night. The wound above her eyebrow had reopened when she climbed to the position, a small, fresh seeping that she addressed with a strip of medical tape from the trauma kit without stopping or slowing, the way you fix a minor equipment malfunction on the move. From the eastern position, she could see the extraction corridor. She could also see on the far southern edge of her observation range the 2 positions she had marked on the map militia elements that Victor had not pulled with him when he left, which told her that his withdrawal from personal engagement did not constitute a withdrawal of his full network. The militia elements were still operational. They were not in the extraction corridor, but they were close enough to the corridor's southern margin that a platoon moving with any amount of noise or deviation would intersect their observation range. The SEAL platoon needed to move quietly and on the precise line she had drawn. She watched the corridor and waited. At 0:11, she heard the platoon begin to move. She heard them before she saw any sign of them. The faint composite sound of 11 men moving in practiced silence, which was nonetheless different from the silence of the desert itself. She tracked their movement by sound for 3 minutes before she had a visual, and what she saw confirmed that Derek had used the map exactly as intended. The line was correct. The pace was controlled. The formation was disciplined. They were going to make it. She watched them move and felt something that she had been carrying at a distance for 11 days arrive suddenly close. The weight of what these 11 men represented, not as an operational objective, but as a human fact. 11 people with names she mostly didn't know, and histories she had only inferred, and lives that extended far beyond the coordinates of this desert into a world that had nothing to do with her. 11 people whose continued existence she had structured 12 days of her own existence around. She had been invisible to all of them. That was exactly right, That was exactly as it should be. And yet, at 019, the Southern militia element moved. She saw it on the edge of her range, three men detaching from the position and angling northeast at a pace that was too purposeful to be routine. They had not seen the platoon, but they had heard something, some fragment of sound that had reached them on a favorable wind shift, and now they were moving toward the source with the instinctive, dangerous energy of people whose job is to investigate exactly this kind of thing. The platoon was 300 meters from the extraction window. The militia element was 240 meters from an intersection with the platoon's route. Elena did the calculation in 2 seconds. She could not close the distance to intercept physically. She could not signal the platoon without noise. She could fire from her current position, but the angle required her to shoot across the platoon's route, which she would not do. One option, she stood up. She stood upright on the eastern overwatch position. The first time in 12 days she had presented a full vertical profile against the sky, and she moved. Not toward the militia element and not toward the platoon, but directly east, openly making sound, creating the signature of a moving human being in terrain where moving human beings drew attention. The militia element heard her. She heard them redirect 3 sets of footsteps, changing angle, moving toward her instead of toward the platoon, drawn by the sound of something that should not be there and now was unmistakably there. She ran. Not away, she ran across the face of the terrain, keeping the militia element engaged, keeping herself between them and the extraction corridor, buying the platoon the 4 minutes it needed to cross the final 300 meters and reach the window. She ran with a body that was asking serious questions about this decision and received no satisfying answers. And she ran with a rifle she could use if she had to and preferred not to, because the sounds of a firefight at this range would reach every remaining asset in the sector. She heard the extraction vehicle at 0027. She heard it arrive, and she heard the change in the platoon's sound signature. The shift from careful movement to the faster, controlled urgency of men loading into transport, and she heard the vehicle begin to move, and the sound of it moving away was the most complete sound she had experienced in 12 days. Clean, final, done. She stopped running at 0031. The militia element had pulled up 200 meters behind her, cautious, now uncertain whether to continue pursuing a single unknown contact when their primary mission objective had presumably already cleared the area. She could hear them on their radio reporting contact, requesting guidance. She did not wait for the guidance. She moved west and down and into a terrain fold so deep and so cold that the first minute in it was like being submerged, and she went still and she listened to the desert return to itself. 11 SEALs, 0 fatalities. The thread behind her sternum went slack for the first time in 12 days. She reached her extraction cache at 0118 and activated the beacon. She did it sitting down because her legs had decided that the period of reasonable negotiation was over and made their position on continued vertical operation very clear. She sat with her back against the terrain and activated the beacon, and then sat quietly for a moment before doing anything else, which was not something she allowed herself often and which felt right now almost unbearably necessary. The wound above her eyebrow was seeping again. She addressed it properly, this time cleaned, clothes, dressed, working by feel in the dark, with the careful impersonality of someone performing a task on equipment that happened to be her own face. The shoulder was bruised but not structurally compromised. The eye was clearing. The scope was destroyed beyond salvage, and she removed it from the rifle field. Stripped, the rifle wiped it down, reassembled it. Ritual. Function. The work of hands that know what they're doing and do it because the doing is itself a form of stability. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the compass. She had carried it there since the water source pressed against her sternum, through the extraction map in the confrontation with Victor and the run across the face of the terrain, and it had the warmth of her own body in it, now indistinguishable from her own warmth the way things do when they have been carried long enough. She turned it in her hands. She read the engraving again, by touch tracing the letters with her thumb. Isaiah 6:8. She knew the passage. Thomas had quoted scripture rarely. He was not a man who leaned on language when silence served, but he had quoted that one once in the early months of her training when she had asked him why he did this work, when the work gave nothing back. He had been quiet for a long time, and then he had said it. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." She had not understood it then. She had been too new to the work, too focused on the technical architecture of what he was teaching to understand what he was actually saying. She understood it now. She closed her fingers around the compass and held it, and the pressure behind her eyes arrived with the full force of everything she had been managing at a distance for 6 years. Thomas and invisibility, and the specific loneliness of a life designed to be unknown, and 11 men who were somewhere in an extraction vehicle crossing the desert toward home, and would spend the rest of their lives not quite understanding why they were alive. And Derek Holloway, who had stood in the empty desert and spoken to the air, because he understood that speaking mattered even when no one could hear you. She had been heard, not by anyone who would confirm it, not in any record that would acknowledge her, but in the way that mattered, in the way Thomas had meant when he said stay dark forever, which she now understood had never meant be nothing. It had meant be nothing so that others could be something. It had meant make the sacrifice clean and quiet and complete so that the people you were protecting never had to know the cost. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. She did not cry. That was not quite right. It was more that the thing that would have been crying if she were a different person in a different life doing a different kind of work was present and acknowledged and then folded carefully back into the interior space she kept for it. She had gotten very good at folding things. At 02:14, she heard the extraction vehicle. She put the compass back in her breast pocket. She checked her rifle, her gear, her condition. She stood up. Her legs accepted this grudgingly. She looked out at the desert for a long moment before the vehicle reached her position. The desert looked back with its usual comprehensive indifference, its knowledge of all the things that had happened in it and all the things it intended to keep. And Elena thought that there was something honest about that, something she had come to appreciate over 6 years of living inside it. The desert never asked who you were. It only asked whether you could survive it. She had survived it. And tomorrow or next month, or in 6 months, in whatever desert or mountain or urban operational environment came next, she would begin again. Different terrain, different platoon, different threat architecture. Same job, same invisibility, same discipline of erasure that Thomas had taught her and that she had been carrying forward ever since alone in the belief that carrying it forward was the only meaningful thing left she could do with what he had given her. The vehicle stopped. The door opened. Inside, 2 people she did not know. Extraction team professional faces she would not remember and who would not be told her name looked at her with the particular expression of people who have been briefed that what they are extracting is classified, that the person they are picking up does not exist in any file they have access to, and that their job is transport and nothing else. She got in. The door closed. The desert fell away behind her as the vehicle moved. She watched it go, watched the terrain she had spent 12 days memorizing recede into the dark behind the vehicle's rear window, and she felt the compass against her sternum, and thought about Derek Holloway touching his breast pocket where it had been. He had given away the thing that carried his family name, the thing his father had given him. He had set it on a rock in the desert for a person he had never seen and would likely never see because he had decided that person deserved to know they had been recognized. She had been invisible for 6 years. One person had seen her anyway. She faced forward and said nothing, and the vehicle carried her through the desert and then out of it, and behind them the first pale line of a new dawn was beginning at the eastern horizon, coloring the sky in the slow and indifferent way that skies do without regard for what has happened beneath them. 11 men were alive. Mission complete. The cost was her own to carry the same way it had always been, the same way Thomas had always carried his. She carried it. The debrief room was in a building that did not have a public address in a city she was not going to name, behind a door that required 2 separate access credentials and the physical presence of the woman in Arlington who had recruited Elena 6 years ago and who was named in the one classified document set that acknowledged Elena's existence simply as Handler 1. Her actual name was Margaret Voss. She was 61 years old. She kept her gray hair cut short and practical, and she had the specific quality of stillness that Elena associated with people who had been in proximity to operational work for long enough that stillness had become their natural state rather than a cultivated one. She was the 4th person who knew Elena existed. She was also, in every functional sense, the closest thing Elena had to a superior officer, though neither of them used that language. Margaret was waiting when the extraction team delivered Elena at 06:14. She did not say anything when Elena came through the door. She looked at the wound above the eyebrow, the bruised shoulder, the destroyed scope still clipped to the rifle Elena was carrying, the way you carry a tool that is still useful even after it has been partially broken. And she made the assessment that people like Margaret make complete rapid without visible reaction. And then she said, "Sit down." Elena sat. "Water," Margaret said and put a bottle in front of her. Then, start at day 10. Elena drank half the bottle. She set it down. She looked at the table for a moment and then looked at Margaret and began speaking not the way civilians debrief, reaching for words to describe experience, but the clean operational narration of someone reporting facts in sequence, stripping language to its minimum, letting the events carry their own weight without editorial assistance. She spoke for 40 minutes. Margaret listened without interrupting. She had a legal pad in front of her, and she wrote on it occasionally, but her eyes stayed on Elena, which was something Elena had noticed years ago. Margaret listened with her whole face, not just her ears. It was one of the things that had made Elena trust her in the beginning, when trust had been in very short supply. When Elena finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Victor Net," she said. "Yes. You had him in your sights and you let him walk." It was not a question. It was not a criticism. It was a statement that was also a door, and Margaret was waiting to see whether Elena would go through it. "He was right about his own assessment," Elena said. "Killing him would have cost time and noise I didn't have. The platoon needed the corridor clear." She paused, and he stepped back. He stepped back. "When I told him to," Elena looked at the table. "He could have pushed the engagement. He made a choice not to." She was quiet. That choice deserves to be acknowledged. Margaret studied her for a long moment with those still, comprehensive eyes. "Are you telling me Victor Net walked away because he respected what you are?" "I'm telling you he walked away. His reasons are his." "And the compass?" Elena reached into her breast pocket. She set it on the table between them. Margaret looked at it without touching it. She read the engraving. She was quiet for a long time. "The staff sergeant went back to the desert," she said finally. It was not something Elena had known. Her pulse shifted. 2 days after extraction. He filed for a personal leave request, which his CO found unusual but approved. He went back to the sector alone. Margaret picked up the compass, turned it over. He spent 6 hours reconstructing the engagement. We know because he filed an informal report, not through official channels, through his chaplain, who forwarded it to the relevant desk because the chaplain understood that what he was describing was above his classification level. Elena said nothing. She was very still. He found the overwatch position. He found the brass. He found the route you ran to draw the militia element away from the corridor. Margaret set the compass back on the table. He wrote in the chaplain's report that he wanted it on record, even classified record, that someone had been there, that the survival of his platoon was not luck or superior positioning or any of the things the official assessment would say it was. She paused. He wrote that he owed a debt he didn't know how to pay to someone he didn't know how to thank. The pressure behind Elena's eyes arrived again. She managed it the way she always managed it, completely, and without visible sign, the long practice of it, making the management almost effortless, which was its own particular sadness. "He doesn't need to thank anyone," she said. "No," Margaret agreed. "He doesn't. But he needed to try." She looked at Elena directly. "There's a difference between those two things, Elena. You know that." Elena knew that. She picked up the compass and put it back in her breast pocket. The medical assessment took 3 hours. Concussion protocol, fragment removal from above the eyebrow, 4 pieces small, 2 of which she had not known were there, shoulder imaging, eye examination, the comprehensive and slightly impersonal evaluation of a body that had been used hard and needed to be certified, functional before it could be used again. The doctor was a civilian contractors cleared who had seen enough operatives come through this process that he performed it without curiosity and without the particular kind of pity that Elena found more difficult to manage than the physical evaluation itself. He was efficient and honest, and when he finished, he said, 6 weeks minimum before field evaluation. The eye needs to settle. The shoulder needs to settle. Your body is telling you something, and in my professional opinion, you should listen to it. Noted, Elena said. That's not a yes. It's not a no either. He gave her the expression that doctors give patients who have already decided how much of the medical advice they intend to follow, which is an expression somewhere between resignation and respect. 6 weeks, he repeated, minimum. She dressed and went back to the debrief room. Margaret had not left. She had coffee now, 2 cups, and she pushed one across the table when Elena sat down. This was Elena recognized a shift in the register of the conversation. The operational debrief was finished. Whatever came next was something else. Command's assessment came through while you were in medical, Margaret said, and survival rate statistically impossible, contributing factors unknown. Margaret said it with the dry precision of someone reading from a document, which she was. The official record will show superior SEAL platoon performance under adverse conditions, favorable terrain factors, and degraded militia operational capacity. She set the document down. Your name appears nowhere. That's correct, Elena said. That is correct, Margaret agreed. It is also, after 6 years of this, something I find myself wanting to address. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, a gesture so ordinary, so human, that it landed with unexpected weight in the sterile air of the debrief room. You are the most capable observer I have ever run. You are also the most isolated, and those two things are not unrelated. Elena looked at her. Thomas built a methodology, Margaret continued. He built it in partnership. He was never intended to be the only practitioner, and you were never intended to carry it alone indefinitely. She paused. There are 4 candidates in the current training cohort who have the profile, the raw capacity. Another pause, more deliberate. I want you to consider training them. The room was very quiet. Elena had not considered this. She had not considered it because it had not been a category that existed in the structure of her life. Her life was the field, the invisibility, the work in the deep solitary discipline that made the work possible. The idea of training someone was the idea of being Thomas, and being Thomas was the idea that she had been moving toward and away from simultaneously for 6 years without ever quite arriving at a decision about it. They'd be seen, she said. Eventually, yes, some of them. They'd lose people. Margaret's expression did not change, but something in it deepened. Yes, they might. And they'd have to keep going anyway. Yes. Elena looked at her coffee. She thought about the 4 candidates Margaret had mentioned, people she didn't know, whose faces she had never seen, who had some quality that Margaret's assessment had flagged as sufficient for the work. She thought about herself at that stage, uncertain, technically capable, not yet understanding that the technical capability was the least of what the work required. She thought about Thomas finding her, assessing her, deciding she was worth building. She thought about what it had cost him to be right. They need to understand what it is before they agree to it, she said. That's why I want you to teach them. I'm not Thomas. No, Margaret said. You're what Thomas built. That's not smaller Elena. That's further along. 3 weeks later, in a different building, in a different city, Derek Holloway was in his kitchen at 06:30, making coffee when his wife came downstairs and said, "You're doing that thing again." What thing? The thing where you stand at the counter and look at nothing for 10 minutes and I'm not supposed to ask about it. He turned. Sarah Holloway was 37 years old and had been married to Derek for 11 years, which meant she had spent 11 years developing the specific fluency of a person who lives with someone whose job cannot be discussed and whose interior life as a result has to be read through indirect evidence. She was very good at it. She had always been very good at it. I'm fine, he said. I know you're fine. Fine isn't the same as here. She took the coffee he had made and sat at the kitchen table and looked at him with the patient directness of a woman who has decided that 11 years is long enough to wait for someone to say the thing they're not saying. You went back out there. He had told her that much. Not the sector, not the specifics, not anything that could have compromised anything. Just that he had gone back. I found what I was looking for, he said, which was, he was quiet for a moment. He thought about the overwatch position he had reconstructed, the brass casing he had found buried to the second knuckle in packed cement and invisible unless you were looking for it and knew what an invisible thing looked like. The angles he had mapped, the route he had walked, the 6 hours he had spent piecing together the shape of what had happened in the desert while his platoon slept. Evidence, he said finally, that someone was there, that we didn't just get lucky. He looked at Sarah. There was a person out there for 12 days keeping my men alive, alone, without being asked and without being acknowledged and without anyone knowing. He stopped. I needed to know that was real. Not just a theory Carver and I built because we didn't have another explanation. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and it was real. It was real. She looked at him with that 11 years fluency, and she saw what he was carrying. Not the operational details which she didn't need, but the weight of the thing which she had always been able to read. You're not going to be able to thank them properly, she said. It was not a question. No. That bothers you. It's going to bother me for a long time, he said. Yes. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say, because some debts are real and unpayable simultaneously, and the honest thing to do with them is to carry them rather than pretend they can be discharged. He turned his hand over and held hers. Tell me about the kids, he said. She told him. He listened. And the morning came into the kitchen the way mornings do, indifferent to everything that had happened before, it interested only in what came next. Elena began working with the first candidate in the 5th week of her recovery. His name was Daniel Cho. He was 29 years old, former Force Recon, and he had the quality that Margaret had described as the profile, not the technical skills, which could be built, but the psychological architecture underneath them. The ability to be still, the ability to be unknown without experiencing that unknowing as a deprivation, the ability to look at a world that would never acknowledge you and find that sufficient. He was also, Elena recognized in the first hour, profoundly underestimating what he was walking into. They met in a training facility that looked from the outside like nothing in particular. Inside, it was sparse and functional and designed for a kind of training that had no standardized curriculum, because Thomas had built his methodology one person at a time, adaptive and specific, tuned to the particular strengths and particular blind spots of whoever he was teaching. Elena stood in front of Daniel Cho and looked at him for 30 seconds without speaking. He held the silence well. Most people didn't. In the first meeting, they filled it with small adjustments, weight shifts, micro-expressions of discomfort. He was still. Tell me why you want this, she said. Because I'm good at it. That's not why. He looked at her. He had steady dark eyes and the particular facial stillness of someone who has spent years in situations where expression is a liability. I'm good at being unseen, he said. In the field I've always been. He stopped. Started again. I've always been most effective when I'm operating alone, when no one knows where I am. He paused. It felt like a limitation. My CO kept saying I had a trust problem, a team integration problem. He looked at her directly. Then someone told me about this program and I started thinking it wasn't a limitation. It was a direction. Elena was quiet for a moment. It's not a direction, she said. It's a pun. She let that sit. What you're describing, the effectiveness, when no one knows where you are, that's real. And it's valuable, and it's the foundation of this work. But it's not the work. She moved not toward him, just a shift, a change in the energy of her presence in the room that she had learned from Thomas and had spent 6 years refining into something that was entirely her own. The work is carrying that capacity for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years alone without acknowledgement, making decisions that save lives that will never know they were saved. The work is losing someone and continuing. The work is being so invisible that the people you protect will go home and tell their families they got lucky. She paused. Can you live in that? Daniel Cho looked at her for a long moment. I don't know, he said. It was the right answer. Elena had prepared herself for the wrong ones, the confidence, the eagerness, the performance of certainty. The honest answer arrived and landed differently. Good, she said. If you'd said yes, I'd have sent you back. She turned. We start with terrain reading, not maps ground. There's a difference, and the difference takes months to understand. Follow me. He followed her. In the months that came after Elena taught Daniel Cho the things Thomas had taught her, and the things 6 years alone had added to what Thomas had given her, and the things she had learned in 12 days of desert that she was still in the process of understanding completely. She taught him the notation system, the patience architecture, the discipline of silence, as a sustained practice rather than a situational tool. She taught him how to read threat environments and how to touch them without leaving fingerprints, and how to make decisions in the space between one breath and the next, when the situation requires a decision and does not offer the luxury of more time. She taught him to take weapons when lives would serve, because a round is a commitment, and a commitment has weight. She taught him that invisibility was not absence. It was a form of presence, so disciplined that it operated below the threshold of detection, and that below that threshold, fully present and fully committed, was where the real work happened. He was slow at first and then fast. He was uncertain and then deliberate. He made mistakes that she corrected without anger, the way Thomas had corrected hers, not because the mistakes didn't matter, but because the correction was more useful than the consequence. Halfway through the 4th month, he came to her after a field exercise with an expression she recognized. "I found the hide," he said, "the one you set up on the North Ridge. I found it." She had placed it 4 days before and had been watching him not find it with the patience of someone who has been the thing that cannot be found for long enough to understand what finding it requires. How, she asked. The absence, he said. Everything around it was normal. Too normal. He stopped. "That's what you do, isn't it? You make the ground too clean." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's what I do." He nodded slowly. She could see him filing it, not just the tactic, but the principle underneath it, the understanding that at a high enough level, the presence of extraordinary skill reads as the absence of ordinary disturbance, and that absence is itself a signal to anyone trained to see it. Thomas had taken 8 months to teach her that. Daniel Cho had found it in 4. She said nothing about that. She turned and walked back to the training position and let him follow, because that was what Thomas had always done: move forward. Let you keep up trusted you to extract what was useful from the gap between where you were and where he was going. She was teaching him what Thomas had taught her. She was also, she understood, teaching herself what Thomas had meant. 7 months after the desert, a classified assessment crossed Margaret Voss's desk with an operational summary that described in the careful and deliberately unspecific language of documents designed to be read by people who need to know less than they think they do a series of events in a sector that no one was officially operating in. 11 Navy SEALs, 0 fatalities, mission complete. Contributing factor: unknown asset intervention. Nature of intervention: unattributable. Recommendation file closed. Margaret read it twice. Then she picked up a pen, and in the margin of the document, in handwriting small enough that it would not reproduce clearly on a copy, she wrote 4 words. She knows what it cost. She filed it. The file went to the place where files like it go: the deep, quiet archive of things that happened and were real and will never be publicly acknowledged. Because the world they happened in does not run on acknowledgement. It runs on the work. On the people who do the work without asking for the acknowledgement. On the specific and demanding discipline of being the thing that no one sees, carrying the weight that no one measures, making the decisions that no one will ever fully understand. Thomas Reyes had built that discipline into one person. That person had carried it forward for 6 years alone, and then had begun carefully and with full understanding of the cost to build it into others. The myth would take time. Myths always do, but it had already begun in the stories that 11 SEALs told each other in the informal report, that a chaplain had forwarded up a chain of classification in the way Derek Holloway sometimes paused in the middle of an ordinary day and touched the place on his chest where a compass used to be. A guardian who had never existed had saved everyone who mattered, not because she was invisible, because she had chosen to be every day for 6 years through loss and silence and the long discipline of a life designed to leave no trace. And that choice, made again and again in the dark without witness or recognition, was the most complete and costly and human kind of courage there is. Elena Castellano had walked into the desert as a ghost. She walked out of it as something Thomas Reyes had always believed was possible and had spent his life trying to build. A guardian. Unseen, present, sufficient. She had been invisible to everyone, and that was exactly why 11 men came home.